the economic growth and progress is a statement that Prime Minister Modi made, and he said, when we took charge, and this is a story of India's political economy, when we took charge, India was the 10th largest economy in the world. Today, it's the 5th, and it will be 3rd very, very soon, unless, of course, you don't vote us back. So, asking for votes there, but also guaranteeing growth in process.
Absolutely. Let's look at the statement that came from Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and let's try and pull up that statement for you. But primarily, as I see this, is a growth guarantee. And unfortunately, nobody can really guarantee anything. We've seen what happened in the world. We've seen what happened with the pandemic, right? We've seen what happened even prior to that with demonetization. So Prime Minister Modi pretty much giving a guarantee saying that we have to achieve the target of making India a developed nation in the next 25 years. This, of course, is the Amrit Kal that has been talked about and mentioned in multiple forums ever since Independence Day 2021 onwards, that the next 25 years are the Amrit Kal. And this is pretty much, in Prime Minister's own terms, this is his guarantee that India is going to be a developed nation once we complete 100 years of independence. But let's look at the data. I think it's difficult to challenge the numbers right now, because what he has said is pretty much the fact. We were a $2 trillion economy, and end of financial year 23, we were at a $3.75 trillion economy. So in dollar terms, we have seen a growth of about 87% overall, not a CAGR, not a year-on-year. But overall, the economy has grown about 87 odd percent. So I think the momentum is already in place for India to break that threshold of being the 5th largest economy and enter the exclusive club of the top 3. But is it only politics and policy to laud for that effort? I don't think so. I think that growth momentum had started even during the UPA's journey, right? We saw the results of that accrue over time. Interestingly, Prime Minister Modi is talking about the infrastructure push which has taken place in the last 9 years. No doubt, you've got to give him credit and give the credit to Nitin Gadkari, the highway and road minister, for pumping in as much as about $34–35 trillion already into infrastructure, another $10 trillion likely to be invested in this year. But what this means is that the GDP growth that we are seeing on account of, let's say, the full 10 years of Modi's government of about 45–50 odd trillion rupees, which is a trillion is a lakh crore. So 50,000 lakh crore rupees in infrastructure spend has happened by the government, not by the private sector. So if you look at the traditional GDP formula, it has to be a mix of consumption, it has to be a mix of government spending, it has to be a mix of private sector capex investments, and it has to be a mix of net exports. Unfortunately, the only area where India is continuing to register growth is government spending. And this government spending is not happening out of thin air. This government spending is happening out of the taxes that the middle class is burdened with. So these taxes are getting deployed for infrastructure development, which is great for the overall long-term prospects of the country, because that is going to add employment, multiplier effect of connecting cities, connecting rural India, urban India, supply chain, all of that. But I'm not happy about the fact that this growth is not really consumption-driven growth or growth by capital investments of the private sector, and which I think, depending on the political environment, once we are through with elections and the next government is sitting in the hot seat around this time, earlier than this time next year, which is when I think some semblance of stability in policy is going to result in spending by the private sector. Now, inflation, of course, has been an issue. COVID had been an issue to slow down consumption and expenditure by citizens on consumption. But at the same time, we are also seeing the emergence of an aspirational India, which is buying houses and buying cars, both new and second-hand cars, and adopting electric vehicles, electric mobility, like we've never seen before. So I think a lot of what Prime Minister Modi is committing to and promising, by way of economic growth for India, has to come on account of both the private sector spending and has to come on account of consumption taking off. And third largest economy, to my mind, should not be a barometer when rest of the world, the developed economies in Europe, and US are degrowing, or if not degrowing, are growing at a much lower clip than India. So you could become the third largest in the world on account of other economies not growing as fast. In absolute terms, are we still going to be any contender to compete against China and US, the top two economies in reverse order, US being the largest, China being the second? I doubt it. Even if you're able to reach the $5 trillion economy mark by end of this decade, by 2030 or so, China would have grown to become a $30 trillion economy. US would have grown to become a $50 trillion economy. So the gap between the third and the second is still going to be enormous. And we may be lauding ourselves that we are the third largest, but we will be the third largest still with a gap down. And that is something that we need to work towards.
All right. So work on the gap that exists between the second, third largest economies. Currently, India being the fifth largest economy in the world. A lot of promises being made by Prime Minister, of course, on the back of the fact that the government will come back to power. And if that happens, Prime Minister is assuring that India will become third largest economy. Whether that is something we should celebrate at this point in time, well, Karthik clearly has explained all those factors. We will, of course, have to wait and watch out for how. And you know, something very interesting I think we should also touch on, and that is, Karthik, how much of it is in government's control and private sector's control? Because experts tepid demand, economic degrowth or slow recovery overall worldwide is not in India's control. So many of these factors that would help India's GDP align to its growth forecast would also depend on how external factors are going to play up, and a lot of that is not in government's control. So promise of growing at that rate,
guarantee rather, it's a guarantee comes with the Modi guarantee, the stamp of,
yes,
of Prime Minister Modi.
Amit.
It's like pre-COVID, Prime Minister Modi had said 5 trillion by 2025. Because COVID happened, that is not going to happen. 5 trillion may happen by 2027 or turn of the decade. But so you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Maybe there's another virus that comes around. Maybe there's
God forbid.
So the guarantee is a little bit of a stretch.
Right.
But yeah, capital from the government side, like I said yesterday, they are doing certain things right. Capital expenditure is a problem, but they have extended the government spend from 7.5 lakh crores to 10 lakh crores. But that is to prime the private sector to basically push in more capital expenditure.
Basically waiting for private sector to jump into fray before
animal
we can
spirits of the private sector to be unleashed, as they call it.
Waiting for the animal spirits to be unleashed.
It's not technically fair to only blame the pandemic for whatever little degrowth that we saw, and the whole world saw that. So, I'm talking again in the context of this interconnectedness of the world. The world's a global village. There are interdependencies. But I think we had seen growth slow down to 6% levels even for the 2 years before the pandemic hit in 2020. So 2018 and 2019 also saw low growth. Now, let's put this into context again. And since Prime Minister Modi was talking numbers, I think let's just bring up some numbers which global agencies like IMF and World Bank are talking about. World Bank says that for India to become a developed nation in the 100 years of its independence, which is 25 years from now, India needs to grow at 7.6%. RBI's own projection for FY24 is 7% growth, right? Now, every year that you lag the 7.6% growth, you need to, so anything below 7.6, you will have to compensate for that over time by growing at a larger clip. So larger than 7.6% in an environment where you don't really know how the global uncertainties are going to pan out will be difficult.
Absolutely.
Now, IMF, on the contrary, has, even though it has revised upwards India's growth projection, it has taken it up to 6.1% from 5.9%. So I'm saying, even though RBI's projection, Finance Ministry's projection last year, FY22, was exceeded by the actual numbers which came out at 7.2%, I think overall, if the IMF and the World Bank data is to be taken, IMF says 6.1% is going to be your growth rate. India says we will grow at 7%. IMF says you need to grow at 7.6%. It's a fairly large 150 basis points of delta that we are talking about between the lowest and the highest projection to become a developed economy. So yes, I think we are bang in the middle of or the start point of the election fever. It is NDA versus INDIA. It is Modi versus INDIA. I think this is an election clarion call. This is something that is being announced to woo investors, because nobody uses words like guarantee, right? I think we live in an interconnected world, like you said. We don't have control over what oil prices are going to look like. We don't know whether the lithium sector opening up to private sector is going to give us electric batteries or not. We don't know what kind of investments get made in India by foreign players and domestic private players. So there are a lot of areas where guarantees could be falling through the cracks, may not be sustainable.
Absolutely.